And so the program you're about to see today is really special because we have two wonderful 3Gs with us today. Marissa Lepor is on our 3G board, and if you're interested in our 3G group, you should talk to Marissa afterwards. She is here to interview her lifelong friend, Chloë Cassens, about Chloe's grandfather, who has an extraordinary story, and you will hear it, and I won't spoil any of the surprises, but you will hear his extraordinary story as told by his granddaughter, which I think is really special. So without further ado, Chloë and Marissa, take it away.
I'm very excited to have all of you here this afternoon. It was wonderful to see how many people are here for the first time, because that's really what we want these events to do, is continue the story of Holocaust education and remembrance. And it's not just talking to people who already know about it, but it's really expanding that into communities. The museum does a lot for education. They're always bringing in students from schools all around LA, and now have virtual programs where they do a lot of education around the world virtually. So this is exactly what this is all meant to do. And as Jen mentioned, I'm on the 3G board at the Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles. I've been on the board for the past 8 years. And as she said, 3G is for third generation. So our board is comprised entirely of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. We all share a passion for honoring the memories of our grandparents and their friends and loved ones who perished during the Holocaust, as well as those who survived but are no longer with us. As a grandchild of survivors, both my mom's mother and father were both Holocaust survivors. I grew up hearing about their lives in Europe before the Holocaust, the events leading up to Nazi occupation, and the unfathomable conditions they endured while in concentration camps or in hiding. However, not only did I hear these stories, but I also heard how they rebuilt their lives after the war. A common thread of all these stories is resilience. The emotional resilience, the mental resilience, the physical resilience, and the intangible, undefinable resilience that flows through their blood. As grandchildren, that's what we're lucky enough to get from them. It's that magic that ties us all as descendants of Holocaust survivors together. Some people call it inherited trauma, which is very real, but it's also inherited strength. I think you'll notice the concept of resilience will be a key theme of today's discussion, as that's what really inspired this event in the first place. This event is especially meaningful to me, as Jen mentioned, Chloë and I have been friends since we were 2 and grew up with each other's families, including our grandparents. We were both exceptionally close with our grandparents, and while they aren't alive anymore, we continue to honor their legacies. As many of you already know, Chloë is the granddaughter of Severin Wunderman, a child hidden in Belgium, who later became the world's largest collector of Jean Cocteau. She is currently the representative of his collection, which makes up the contents of the Musée Jean Cocteau in Menton, France. As the collection's representative, she works to educate others about Severin's legacy and popularize Cocteau's work around the globe. We'll discuss Severin's background in further detail throughout the discussion, but just to provide some context. Severin was born in 1938 in Belgium. A survivor of the Holocaust, his extraordinary trajectory saw him go from a child hidden from the Nazis to striking gold as the founder of Gucci Timepieces and chairman of Quorum Timepieces. He dedicated his life to philanthropy and anonymously gave his fortune away to those who needed it most. Married 7 times to 6 women, the love of his life was his art collection. He amassed the world's largest collection of works by Jean Cocteau, starting from when he was 19 years old until his death in 2008. On December 31st, 2004, he was named the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. Chloë can re-say that. By President Jacques Chirac. The Musée Jean Cocteau collection, Severin Wunderman, opened in 2011 and contains over 1,200 pieces donated by Wunderman to Menton, France. So now that everyone's a little bit more familiar with Severin, let's get to Chloë. And we'll also have some time for questions at the end, so please keep track of any that arise. Let's begin with Severin's story. I know I covered it a bit in the introduction, but could you provide some additional detail on Severin's experience during the Holocaust?
Yes. So my grandfather, Severin, was born in 1938. So if you do the math, he was a toddler when the war broke out. His two older siblings were in their sort of early teens, mid-teens, so they were much older. And he was hidden by a man named Père Bruno, who was a Jesuit priest. And actually, while I was doing some research for today, Père Bruno was also a self-described anarchist, which I thought was pretty cool and also kind of prescient. But Père Bruno hid around 400 children in Belgium. He was unique in that he personally dropped off almost every single child that he hid in his network. And Bruno hid my grandfather in a blind school for children. And so he was the only child with sight, and he would lead the blind children around, you know, sort of had no idea really what was going on in the world outside. And at the end of the war, the nuns, this was quite common, but the nuns who had custody of him refused to give him back to his family. So my grandfather's father and his brother, who was around 16, 17 at the time, kidnapped him. They went into this convent, they tied up the nuns, and they took him back. So he had an interesting experience with that. You know, talking about inherited trauma, certainly definitely a certain flavor of inherited trauma there. And yeah.
So just so everyone really understands what just happened, how old was he when he was put into the school for blind children?
He was probably around 3 or 4.
And then he was kidnapped by his own family
by
at
his
what
own
age?
family. I mean, let's see, 38 to 45.
Yeah.
So he was 7 or 8 years old.
So just if you even just think about that, like really let that sit in.
Like that's how you meet your father.
Is when he claims that he's your father and kidnaps you back from the only thing that you really felt familiar with at all.
This did not happen quietly either.
Yeah.
You know.
So how do you think those experiences shaped Severin?
I mean, you know, it certainly shaped him. His parents unfortunately died not too soon after the war ended. So after all that, he did not spend too much time with his mother or father. But in some ways, I think it made him very close to his siblings. So his two older siblings, almost immediately after the war, moved out here to Los Angeles. And his oldest sister, Bella, I want to say she must have been 18 or 19 when she moved out here, got married very quickly, and she raised him pretty much. So they were very, very bonded. His brother, who participated in the kidnapping, he was also very bonded too, although they did love to bicker at every chance they could. But I think that it really, because there was this age gap and there was this horrific story and this horrific thing that he lived through already at such a young age, it made my grandfather very, at least what I think, this is all conjecture and this is all opinion, but it made him very resilient. It made him very, I don't think hard is the correct word to use, but it definitely made him very steely, I think. And there were certainly ways in which that would seep out into the ways he conducted himself in life, in business, with his family, etc.
And did he speak much about the Holocaust in general, either as a concept or directly about his own experience?
No, not so much. He would give me these odd, he would kind of drop these words of wisdom to me when I was a kid that, looking back, are obviously things that stem from his experience. But at the time, I was like, okay, yeah, advice, I'm going to take it, put it in my pocket for later. But no, the only time I ever heard him speak about his experience during the Holocaust was he was a huge supporter of the Shoah Foundation at USC, and he did a survivor testimony, I think one of the first ones that was recorded. I make a cameo in it at the very end. I was about 3 years old. And so I pretty much only got the story from watching that testimony years later.
And there's an interesting story about his involvement with the Shoah
Yes.
Foundation that I think people would be interested to hear, because I think that shows just even your experience with him. Like, my grandparents didn't talk about the Holocaust much either, and most people didn't. And so I think even as third generation survivors, we find a lot about their stories after they've passed away, or it's a lot of piecing together. It's not like they sit you down and say, let's listen to my trauma. It's like
No.
almost the opposite, because they don't even want you to hear about it at all. They're
It's
very
almost like
protective.
recall, where you're like,
Yeah.
why do I act like this?
Yeah.
And then you have to like really go back, way back to the beginning, where it's before you're even, before your parents even exist. You have to
Yeah.
go way, way, way back. Yeah.
And so how did Severin hear, especially as someone who wasn't very interested in speaking about the Holocaust and sharing his story, or even really talking about it at all, what inspired him to do one of the videos?
Okay. So I have to preface, my grandfather was a very colorful man. And every time I run into someone who knew him, even, I mean, it happens all the time, where they'll say, oh, I knew your grandfather, and they'll tell me this absolutely insane story about him, and I'll go, okay, yeah, that sounds about right. But my grandfather, one of the things that made him very colorful is that he smoked a lot of marijuana. When I was a kid, I thought that that was just grandpa's smell, until my mother had to tell me around 10 or 11 years old that no, that's just not his like natural cologne. And so anyway, one day my grandfather was in his apartment in Westwood watching the news, and this was around the time that Steven Spielberg released Schindler's List, and I imagine he was stoned out of his gourd. And there was a story about Steven Spielberg wanting to, record these survivor stories and set up the Shoah Foundation. And so my grandfather whipped out his checkbook and wrote a ridiculous check and sent it. And even if before adjusting for inflation, if you look at the number, even back, like, it was a really crazy number. And so Steven Spielberg goes, is this real? Like, who is this guy? What is this money? Where did this come from? And it was just because he wanted this foundation to really take off, and he wanted to participate and believed in it. And he and Steven Spielberg became friends. There was a period of time where my grandfather is an Easter egg in Steven Spielberg movies, because he's an extra in a bunch of them. And, it was sort of this beautiful thing just came of like him watching the news and going, oh yeah, we got to get that going.
And so if he didn't share much about his story with you, when did you learn about it, or how did you ultimately learn about it?
That's a good question. I don't know. Honestly, in some way, I feel like in certain ways, I feel like I always knew, but obviously I didn't always know. I think my mother had to tell me what happened when I was a kid, and I think sort of piecemeal as I grew up, the story became adjusted for appropriateness as I aged. But, I always knew my grandfather lived through something, because he really, again, with 2023 glasses, a lot of his behavior was clearly informed by his trauma, for sure.
And I'm sure you've watched his Shoah tape, it seems. Is there anything that you learned about him from watching that you were surprised about, or any story that stuck with you?
Not necessarily my grandfather's tape. I actually really recently watched his brother's tape, which is actually available on YouTube. It's one of the few. So the Shoah Foundation is part of USC, and so usually you have to be a student to access their archives. My grand uncle Uncle Max, his testimony is available in full on YouTube to the public. It's one of the very few that is. And so I watched it not too long ago, and I learned so much from his tape that was really shocking because he was present for this kidnapping. His version of the story was shocking. His experiences as a young teenager living through the Holocaust and being hidden was shocking. And it honestly, that did a lot to paint or fill in the blanks for me. Because it also, just in the way that he delivered the story, it's so, he could have been reading from a picture book. And he's describing just the most brutal acts of violence that one can imagine, as if it's like, smoking a cigarette, like, it happened. So that was really more when I like sort of had gained this fuller picture. I don't know if there's any specifics I should
That makes sense. And I think for people to like get context on that a little bit, especially as third generation, we've heard these stories from our grandparents and it's piecemeal, like Chloe said. It's not like someone sits you down and says, let me tell you the whole story of my existence, because no one even knows how to do that or where to begin. And it's one of these things where you hear about it over time, so you never have this moment of like, when did I first realize I knew my grandparents went through that? But then at the same time, you hear it from your grandparents a little bit, and you hear it from your parents a little bit, and then you hear it from these videos a little bit, and you just start to piece things together, but you never really get a full story. There's always holes, in the same way that if someone even asked you to explain what you did last month, there's no way you could chronologically explain it in one sitting, and then maybe next week you'll remember that you actually saw this other person and this great thing happened or this horrible thing happened. But having someone recall a traumatic experience from their life decades ago is very challenging. And so we spend, I think, a lot of time just piecing things together, and then there's an epiphany moment, or everything is very nonlinear. And so it's
well, and I also think too, like, as we grow up, I'm pushing 30, and so I'm hearing about things that went down. Uncle Max was 16, and I'm going, well, okay, now that I'm like kind of far away from 16 now, like, whoa, like what was I doing then? Not that.
Right.
Not kidnapping my sister, not surviving genocide,
Exactly. Totally. And so kind of skipping forward a little bit, because I think we want to draw the connection a little bit between your grandfather's experience as a survivor, but also his relationship to Cocteau, the artist. And you mentioned to me that he never actually met the artist, but he has a very profound kind of connection to him. What inspired his connection to him, do you think?
That's the question of my life. So I guess first things first, who here is familiar with Jean Cocteau? Okay, so a good amount. So for those who aren't, the very quick and dirty, Jean Cocteau was a very, very important early 20th century artist from France. He was friends with the Surrealists, the Dadaists, the Modernists, everyone, but he kind of belonged to no movement. His work was very much informed by mythology and fairy tales, and he was very, very forward-thinking in many ways. He was a visual artist. He made pottery. He was a filmmaker. He worked with the Ballet Russe. He really kind of did everything. It can be a little difficult to be someone who researches and works in the field of Cocteau because there's just so much variety. So that said, my grandfather started collecting, as Marissa said, when he was 19 years old. The story is that he was walking home from work and he saw Cocteau drawing in a window of a shop and spent his week's wages on it. And that drawing is actually still in the collection today. It still is shown in the museum. It has been beautifully restored. I was looking at it in the archives of the museum in France just a few months ago. And basically from there, I like to say, the fancy word is collection. The reality is it was kind of a hoarding situation. Especially going into these archives, my grandfather got his hands on of course, beautiful pieces of art, but letters, menus, doodles, posters, like programs for plays and dance, like anything that Cocteau might have breathed on, he wanted to have and he got. And it was just this lifelong thing. And, you know, I think going back to your question of why Cocteau, I can imagine my grandfather buying this sketch and really liking it, and then looking into who the artist was and really, I don't know if he felt like kinship necessarily, but Cocteau was so, even today, if you watch Cocteau's films or if you read his books, they are for 2023 radical and modern. And he was working, his first published work came out in 1909 and he died in 1963. So the forward thinking is like, it's light years ahead. And so I think my grandfather might have just really been interested in this genius and wanted to know more. And I think the trap that I fell into of Jean Cocteau is that the further you go in, the more there is to discover, and you can really get lost in it, and it's beautiful. But I just think that that must have been at least the springboard for it. I mean, I'm trying to answer that question.
Yeah.
I've been trying to answer that question. I'm gonna be trying to answer that question forever.
Totally. And one of the things that you told me that was interesting that I was surprised to hear was that he was friends with Coco Chanel, who was a known Nazi collaborator.
Yes.
How did your grandfather reconcile that?
So I'm also realizing that I'm wearing Chanel shoes right now. Oops. So I think a couple of things. My grandfather did not wear Hugo Boss. He refused to drive Volkswagen. The Chanel side of the question I will address. So Chanel was a known Nazi collaborator. She was shacked up at the Ritz with a bunch of officers. This is a known thing. It's not shocking or news to anybody, especially the Chanel company. But in the 50s, a Jewish family actually bought the company from her, which only fueled her anti-Semitism. But that same family still owns Chanel. And so my grandfather actually was completely obsessed with Chanel as a brand. Like he, in his view, elegant women wore Chanel. So I think just sort of there's that running in the background. But as far as Jean Cocteau goes, so Jean Cocteau was, again, very radical and very modern. He was one half of what's sort of commonly called the first modern gay couple. He and his partner, muse, collaborator in art, Jean Marais, they lived their lives completely open in a way that was not done before them and was not done for many, many decades after them. And during the war, being gay obviously was something that could send you to a camp. Sure. But also, just thinking about on top of that, Cocteau was, it's hard to put 2023 terms to things that happened almost 100 years ago, but in today's terms, we would say he was out and proud. And it was very well known that he was out and proud. He actually, there were some Nazi political cartoons and things that came out really targeting him and his homosexuality and his relationship with Jean Marais. So what is stunning to think about, actually, is that Cocteau and Jean Marais lived in Paris for the entirety of the war and survived, and nothing happened. I think a few things may have led to that. I think if your girlfriend Coco is shacked up with some officers at the Ritz, maybe she'll put in a good word and keep you guys from death. But at the same time, I kind of think that, I don't know how quite to phrase it, Cocteau was also very loudly, he was part of the, I don't know what the League Against Anti-Semitism in Europe at the time. He was a member. He was very outspoken, and so I just have to believe that maybe he had this very, very crucial impasse with this person that was, I mean, she sent him to rehab when he was addicted to opium. They were very close friends. I just have to believe that maybe Cocteau, you know, had this struggle with his friend, I think, as we all do in our own much more quotidian ways, where you don't agree with your friends on everything. And so, circling back to the original question, I think because Cocteau himself was not a collaborator, even though he was friends with one, I think that that must not have rankled my grandfather too much in collecting his work.
Yeah.
So
I think there's a lot of lessons from that
Yeah.
people could take
yeah.
today.
There's just a quick aside. As I was doing some research for today, because I knew that question was coming up, even though I did not wear the right shoes for it.
Maybe they're perfect.
They're perfect. I mean, listen, I like what I like. But so Jean Marais, Cocteau's partner, apparently he tried to join the resistance and was turned away. And there's sort of a 50-50 split on why he was turned away from the resistance. He said it was because he was gay. But he was one half of a very loud couple who were very outspoken, and I don't think that when you are in the resistance, what they want is someone who's like out and saying stuff and being really public. So I did find that quite interesting, that because I kind of thought they were a little more neutral, or just, you know, lay low, don't say anything, no one will notice that we're here. But no, they were in the League Against Anti-Semitism, and again, one of them tried to join the resistance and was turned away for reasons.
Fascinating.
But, you know.
And your personal interest in the artist was, how did you develop that personal interest? Was it more of a way to connect with your grandfather, or did you discover the artist on your own? How did that happen?
So my grandfather had this really uncanny quality in that he saw very clearly in myself and my three cousins what we were going to be doing as adults. And so one of my cousins is an extraordinary artist, and he set her up with a studio and paint and canvas and let her rip, you know. My sister, I think he saw she had a really great analytical mind, and they would play dominoes together, which it's a game of math, so I was not a part of that. My other cousin is a screenwriter, and they would watch movies together, and myself, he would tour me around his art collection. And there were times where, you know, I was 8 years old, 9 years old, and we'd be having breakfast together, and he'd say, okay, go get a notebook and a pen. We're going to go run through this room today. And so I'd get my, like, Lisa Frank notebook and my glitter gel pen. And
we probably had the same ones.
We probably did, yeah. And he would explain to me, like, this is the La Belle et la Bête poster. It's from this year. It was made, you know, for this reason. I acquired it for this reason. This is why it's important. Move on to the next. And I really hate the fact that I don't have those notebooks. I can't find them. Maybe they'll turn up. I really want them to turn up. But yeah, I think he just sort of saw that I was kind of nerdy and kind of, I mean, I always had my nose in a book. I still have my nose in a book most of the time. And I think he also knew that because we were very close, that maybe I would have the wherewithal to want to be involved with his collection. He was absolutely right. And so anyway, my grandfather passed in 2008 when I was 14. And kind of before that, the only real exposure I had to Cocteau was via his collection. To be completely honest, I had no idea that I was living in a home full of these extraordinary things. I thought it was just what he liked. I thought it was the stuff on Poppy's walls, you know, like I didn't realize that, you know, having the set pieces of the candelabras with the arms from La Belle et la Bête was going to be a big deal to have as a sconce, you know? And so after his death, as a way to sort of mourn and grieve, I thought, you know what, maybe I should go back to the source here and like get into Cocteau and try to answer that question, why him? And as I did that, I fell in love with Cocteau's work. And I also found this way to still be connected to him and maintain a connection that he started. And so, yeah, now here we are, and I'm still in it. I've written a few pieces of research about Cocteau and in ways that suited me and I thought were interesting. But yeah, I'm in it. I'm still in it.
Very much so. And how has your relationship with Cocteau evolved over time?
I mean, that's a good question. Because my grandfather had so many visual works, paintings, drawings, pieces of pottery, posters, that type of thing, I was not super exposed to his films. And so I would say right now, in August of 2023, I'm really into his filmmaking. I've really evolved to appreciate his storytelling in that sense. I was rewatching, so Jean Cocteau is the first filmmaker to put Beauty and the Beast to film. If you watch his version, you may see where Disney got a lot of their inspiration. His version came out in 1946, so right after the war. And I think it is, again, just to use the same word, it's so radical. He starts the movie with a handwritten sort of prologue where he says, sit back and watch this movie as if you're a little kid. Like, just completely give yourself to wonder and, don't think too much. And I think that if you watch the movie in that way, especially thinking about the immense grief and trauma that the entire continent of Europe was coming out of, it's like, what a beautiful thing to do, is just to give the world this piece of art. So that's sort of something I've been really connecting with, I think, coming out of the pandemic, allowing ourselves to just enjoy something. It's kind of the same sentiment a little bit as like the Barbie movie.
Yeah, I was about to say that. And a lot of your research on Cocteau has happened after your grandfather passed away. Is there anything that you feel like you've learned about your grandfather or understood more, kind of having that space? Yeah,
so I've got a couple stories. Okay. So my first piece of research that I did on Cocteau was about Les Enfants Terribles, which is a book he wrote that he did not direct the film of, but he was so irritating on set that he may as well have directed it. Famously, the director, Melville, was so at wit's end with Cocteau sort of backseat directing that it's kind of argued now, like, who really directed this film. But Enfant Terrible is a French term that really sort of describes like a rebel, or a rebellious person, someone who does what they're not supposed to be doing. That was definitely Jean Cocteau, and that was definitely Severin Wunderman. And maybe myself a little bit too, I don't know. But I definitely feel like that piece of research sort of summoned something, and it really helped me connect those dots that we were talking about of, you get these little flashes of memories and they come together and you go, oh, that's where this all comes from. For example, my mother and my sister and I were talking about this yesterday. My grandfather would definitely drop some weird pieces of advice, and you'd kind of be like, where did that come from? Hold on a second. Like, what do you mean by that? One of them being, if you're going to get in a fight, punch the person first. He did not mean that figuratively. He meant it really literally. And this guy, by the way, Severin, was maybe 5'6" and 100 pounds soaking wet. He was not someone that you'd bet money on winning a bar fight, but he definitely won a few in his lifetime because he punched first. Now, I've not taken that advice literally, but that's definitely enfant terrible behavior. And he was getting into trouble like that well into his 60s. He punched someone first at Les Deux Majots in Paris and got arrested in his 60s. The other guy, I'm sure, deserved it. But he just was...
Your grandfather was not
he was really,
tallest, strongest.
No, he was a real
person.
Like vigilante justice, but he was the only vigilante. Like he was judge and jury and just did things that he felt were right in the moment, and definitely sometimes jumped first without thinking. Another time where he did not connect the punch, but went to punch first, was actually the most important almost fight of his life. So, as Marissa mentioned, my grandfather founded Gucci Timepieces. And I don't know how many people here saw House of Gucci or read House of Gucci. If you've read the book, you actually know who Severin is. He's in the book. He was not in the movie, thankfully. But Aldo Gucci, who I believe was played by the character played by Robert De Niro, I think is who played him. So Aldo Gucci, Al Pacino, sorry, thank you. Al Pacino. Al Pacino played Aldo Gucci, who was running Gucci at the time. My grandfather had this wacky idea to set up a timepiece division at this company. And he went to New York on a whim and went to Gucci, the offices, and kind of waited around to meet Aldo without an appointment. And, you know, depending on which story you get, the important thing is that there was a miscommunication. One person, Aldo, was waiting for his mistress, allegedly, and Severin was the one who was there, so he was not pleased. And he made a comment that was very rude in a dialect of Italian that, unfortunately for him, Severin understood. And so Severin, not backing down, said, like, come say that to my face now. Like, let's go. And so right as they were about to, you know, wind back and throw a punch, Aldo Gucci said, you know what, this guy's crazy. Maybe I should hear what he has to say. And he did, and that's how Gucci Timepieces came about. So maybe don't literally punch someone first unless you really have to. But yes, in life, maybe you should jump first and do the crazy thing and be an enfant terrible and like just, you know, fortune favors the bold in that sense.
And when do you think Severin first thought of the idea for the museum?
It's interesting. So Severin donated his collection around 2004, I want to say, 2004, 2005. And it was actually the country of France who made the museum for his collection. He was made a chevalier, and but really the museum was on France. There were previous iterations of the Cocteau Museum in my grandfather's collection, but none really stuck, I think probably because they were all in America, and Americans just don't care the way that the French do, unfortunately. So that's when that came about. Actually, another aside, sorry, but I was in Monte Carlo in June for a couple of days at a vernissage, an opening at the Nouveau Musée National de Monaco, and their exhibit at the moment is a Jean Cocteau exhibit with a huge loan from my grandfather's collection. And I was there, super jet lagged. I flew in the morning of, went to this party immediately from the airport pretty much, but wanted to show face. And the curator at this museum in Monaco was actually the original curator of my grandfather's collection when the museum opened. Oh. And I was chatting with her, and then again, I had this like light bulb moment because I'm chatting with this woman who's brilliant. And I'm going, hold on a second, you're like in your early 40s? And he must have hired her when she was in her early 20s, which, you know, again, France doesn't play around with their art, and Cocteau is so important to them. And so for him to select a young woman to handle this museum, his collection, cataloging it, she wrote the museum's like book catalog, was no minor thing. And I sort of said that to her. I was like, you know, she sort of said, oh, you know, I think about him all the time. And I said, yeah, you know, me too. But wow, like, I kind of said to her, I was like, you're really impressive, but you must be extra impressive if he hired you at 21. And she burst into tears and was like, oh, you know, I just, like, your grandfather really changed my life. Like, it just became this whole thing. Yeah. And I just feel like he really had this innate thing where he could just see past someone's packaging and into like their brain and really do what was best. And so for the museum, I don't know that he necessarily had such an explicit idea and view for it when he made this donation, but once it was in the works, that was when he said, okay, you know what, we're going to hire this person.
Wow.
And, you know, go from there.
And what's your role at the museum, and what inspired your involvement now versus when it first opened?
So I can't really speak too much about what's going on presently with the museum, but okay, so the museum opened in 2011 in November. Everything was going quite well. It was in this beautiful building designed by a very well-known architect. And unfortunately, the building was designed as such that the museum was on the ground floor and all the archives were underground. And it's in the south of France in a town called Menton, and it is right on the water. And so in very late 2018, there was a catastrophic storm, unprecedented storm that hit this town. And unfortunately, the museum with the archives flooded. And it's still closed. And so that's late 2018. I mean, I saw the photos of what happened when the storm hit. They were sending down boats to get these pieces of art out and back up to land, essentially. But they did get the art out once they were able to take, you know, inventory and figure out what to do. You know, COVID happened. I think we were all there for that. And so they're really still trying to get on their feet. The nice thing is that 90% of the collection has been restored and is okay. And honestly, it all got a little tweak and a facelift and Botox, and it looks amazing. Unfortunately, 10% is permanently lost or destroyed. But those odds are really great, considering it could have been way worse. And from the photos I saw, I'm still amazed that so much was able to be recovered. But again, it's been tough for them. They have not reopened the museum in the same capacity that it was open before. Right now, the museum is open in a satellite space called the Bastion, which is actually just about a block away from the original museum. It's a fort that Cocteau actually designs the mosaic work outside of, but it is, I mean, this room is bigger than that museum, and it's not the same. And so, you know, it was a little quiet, a little too quiet, and I had a moment that my friends call the bolt uprights, like when you bolt upright in the middle of the night and have a light bulb moment. So about a year ago, I had a bolt upright, and I was like, what's happening with the museum? What's happening with all the Cocteau? I spent so much of my time researching this, studying it, devoting myself to it. What am I doing? I could probably be doing something. Maybe I need to go out there and be a little bit of an annoying, enterprising American and, like, you know, light a fire under their butts. And that's kind of what I did. You know, it's a little early to say because I only started doing that this year. But I mean, I actually just came back from a month out there a few days ago. I was out there, and I mean, this year has been a different year because I've spent so much time back in Europe, immersed back in this world of Cocteau, the bureaucracy of France, which is so great. I love it. But yeah, you know, it's just, I don't know. I don't quite know how it came to be or whose fault it was, but it just was this moment where truly in the middle of the night, I like flew out of my bed and was like, what is happening?
Yeah.
So that's now where we're at.
And there were a lot of innovations that took place to restore the art. It wasn't straightforward. I don't know if there's anything you want to share about that.
Yeah, I think what's really been fascinating is that because, again, France is very different from the States, art restoration is a very viable career out there. And there's a team of about, like around 15 specialized art restorers working on restoring this collection. This is like around 1,000 pieces. It took each person around 6 months to restore each piece that they were restoring. And I mean, there's photographs, there's a tapestry, there's sculptures. I mean, and there's still things that are en route. But it's been a process. What's been interesting is that part of this 2019 to 2020 delay was that it was the first time in modern art history that salt water is what damaged art. Usually these people are trained for fresh water, or they're not used to seawater. So you have, on top of the water damage, you have salt damage. Which, from what they told me, which I was getting anxiety just hearing about it, apparently a lot of these works on paper had to be re-soaked in water to rinse the salt, which I don't want that job. I can only imagine how insane that must have been to do. I mean, the pottery had salt caked on it. But from what I heard, they consulted with scientists and art historians in Japan and out in East Asia to come up with these new ways of restoring art and cleaning it up. And I don't know the nitty-gritty details, but whatever they did, it worked. Yeah. It's incredible. And again, everything looks really fresh. And it all got new frames, which is nice.
And talk about resilience. I mean, a crazy thing to have like a global community coming together to heal an art collection that was destroyed by natural events.
Mm-hmm. It's a very 21st century story, I think, in a lot of ways. You know, I mean, it's also been interesting interfacing with the museum staff, who are so incredible. They, talk about trauma. They are traumatized because they love this work. They love this art so much. They feel a real sense of responsibility over it. And so for them, these are the people who at 2 a.m. when they got the notice, like the alarm notice that there was something wrong at the museum, were met with water. These are the people who, one of them had to call the firefighters and the other one just dove underneath the museum and started just pulling out what she could. And they're still very traumatized. And I think it's just been interesting interfacing with them, because being a third generation Holocaust survivor, I feel like we're really used to just picking ourselves up and moving along. Like, we've done it for, I don't know what year this Rosh Hashanah brings in, but Jews have been picking it up and moving on for a long frickin' time. So I think coming into this museum and saying, okay, well, how do we pick it up and move along? They're still very frozen. And it's been a really interesting contrast, because I'm like, okay, guys, like, this is not going to go back to the way it was. So let's, not get over it, but let's like readapt and recollect and move.
Yeah.
LA, let's go. They're a little bit, now I think whenever they see the email come in from me where I'm like, hello, I'm coming again, I'm going to see you. They're like, hello, bonjour, j'arrive, semaine dernière. They're like, oh shit, she's coming. They're like, oh no, not Chloe. She's going to, continue to push us and push us and push us. But it's kind of a kick in the pants for them. And I think Jews are really good at moving forward. We're just really good at it. Call it an inherited trauma, but it is a gift. Our resilience is a gift that we have. It's like a superpower.
And not that every story needs to have a perfect bow, but the vision that you just described of the museum staff going in to save the art from a place that was supposed to be their kind of safe place is very reminiscent of your grandfather getting kidnapped from the blind center.
Yeah.
And to
I
me,
never made that connection until
when you said
now.
that, I just thought about it, but it's very full circle.
It is very full circle, and I feel like, I feel my heart is so full for them, because I don't think they've had many people actually say, hey, you've done this incredible thing. Thank you. Mm-hmm. They've just sort of been met with, again, bureaucratic hell, because it's France and it's a state museum. So there's just paperwork on paperwork and red tape, followed by more red tape. And, you know, again, they've really done an incredible service, not just to my grandfather's collection or the art or, you know, his spirit. They have done this service to France because, again, this is one of the most important French artists. This is the collection of his work. There's not a lot of Jean Cocteau floating out there that was not part of Severin's collection. There really wasn't. Floating, yeah, exactly. There was not a whole lot of it that's out there that, you know, is publicly available still. And so they really, you know, they did this service and they just got not a whole lot of thank you for it. And so, yeah, it's been this interesting contrast of wanting to give my thanks to them, but also then saying, okay, thank you, but we need to move the show along. We can't just revel in that it wasn't permanently destroyed.
And so, speaking of the show, what's next?
A lot. Watch the space. What's next? Well, this year is the 60th anniversary of Cocteau's passing. So I've been hustling to get various spaces around the States, but also around the globe to commemorate that, sort of resurrect him. Actually, I can say I do have a confirmed engagement in New York, November 7th, with FIAF, the French, it's the French Institute Alliance Française in New York. They have a film series called, or film festival every year, and this year is called Film Fantastique, so I'm working with them. They're going to show La Belle et la Bête. But beyond that, I mean, I want two things. I want Cocteau to really get his due outside of France. Every single one of his close friends is a household name in the States, and a lot of people can't even name what these people did, but they know the name. Picasso, Proust, Dali, Chanel, the list goes on and on and on. Why not Cocteau? You know, but with the added bonus of I'd like people to actually know what he did and not just know the name. So there's that. And then the other thing is I was discussing this with you a few days ago, but my grandfather really believed in the mitzvah of tzedakah, of giving to charity without expectation of receiving anything back. And for him, that meant recognition. He gave and gave and gave and gave anonymously, completely. This museum is one of the very few things that actually had his name on it. When I was really, really little, I thought his government name was anonymous because we would go to these galas or institutions and my mom would point to, you know, whatever wall and say, oh, that's your grandfather. You know, he gave, like, you know, whatever. But she'd point to the word anonymous. And I go, yeah, okay, Anonymous Wunderman. Like, that's his name, you know? But it's because he believed that you cannot receive any kind of recognition for what you do for it to truly be a charitable act, which I still believe in as well. My family really we took that to heart. We don't keep kosher, but we do keep that. And, but that said, I do feel like he passed away 15 years ago, and maybe it is time for people to know his name too. I would love for him to have the same name recognition as someone like Peggy Guggenheim or Solomon Guggenheim or any of these well-known, really revered art collectors, because those were some interesting people, but I can tell you he was just as, if not more interesting, and had such an incredible story. And I only really was inspired to take on that half this year. I'm going to send him the video of this later, and he's going to totally be like, why did you say my name? But I have a friend named Alix in Paris who was so moved by Severin's story when I told it to him. And then he said, I thought your grandfather was one of Jean Cocteau's lovers. I thought that that's how he got this massive collection. And then a few more people started to say that to me. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I think when you have such a story of resilience and making something out of nothing like Severin, maybe that story should be a little bit, more well known.
Yeah.
because again, you know, like it didn't even occur to me that people wouldn't know until they said, oh yeah, so he was a lover. Like, it's very French, you know. They're like, oh, your grandfather would love her, and then, you know, your grandmother like later. And I'm like, no, not so much. So yeah, that's really where I'd like to go from here. I will say that I did inherit from my grandfather the quality of not letting it go. So I'm not letting it go. I will pursue this until it's done. And I do think that some of the entities that I'm working with and against don't necessarily realize that. All the better for me.
Yeah.
You know, when I punch first, they're going to be so surprised.
Well, I'm sure he's very proud of you, and I'm sure my grandparents who knew you would also be. So this
They're
was
so lovely.
extra special, and thanks for everyone for
Thank
being
you.
here.
And I do have to say something, which is Marissa here came to me in January of 2022 about doing this event. And at the time I said, I don't know, babe. I don't really think I have that much to say. So she was right, and I was not. And I'd like to put that on the record, on tape, that Marissa knows what she's doing. So
Thank you.
listen to her.
You do too. And we have time for some questions, and Chloe will be here after, I'm sure,
Yeah.
but we'll just start. I'll let
I
Chloe do it.
have to start with a question I have to explain from Liz Goldwyn, who I worked for years, founded a brilliant platform called The Sex Ed. I'm so honored to know her. I'm so heartbroken that I don't work with her anymore, but you got to do what you got to do. And so anyway, Liz, take it away.
Thank you both so much, and thank you for sharing those stories. That was amazing. And at the beginning of the conversation, you said that when you were little, your grandfather used to give you little pearls of wisdom that you stuck in your pocket.
Yes.
And you took one out when you told us about the first punch, but I'm wondering if you could share
Yeah.
the other pearls of wisdom that he left you with.
Yes, I can. Something that he used to say to me that, and I told this story to the French press in April, and I don't think they understood what I was trying to convey, which again, works for me. So my grandfather was born November 19th. I'm November 20th. We're both Scorpios. Yeah. Should be an advertisement enough of what you're getting. But he used to say to me that he was a big scorpion and that I was the little scorpion. And again, coming from a guy who was like 5'6" and 100 pounds, I don't know what he meant by he was a big scorpion, but you know, he would say to me, Chloe, you're the little scorpion. And little scorpions are the most dangerous ones. I guess apparently in the wild, in the desert, the smaller scorpion, the more poisonous it is and the more danger it poses to you. So he just would say that to me at like 8 years old, like, you know, really giving me this advice like Mufasa. And I'd be like, okay, yeah, little scorpion. I don't even know what that means. I didn't know that I was a scorpion. I had no idea. So I think obviously on a personal level, the advice is, you know, you can be small but mighty. Maybe sometimes when you're smaller, you're a little more mighty. But I also think that we can all take that as just, you know, fine, go out and be underestimated. Go out there and like let other people think that the bar is low for you, because when you clear it, it's just going to make them more amazed and more disarmed. And anyway, I did tell that story in French to the Nice Matin. And when they said, oh, do you have a cute memory of your grandfather? And I said, yeah, I have a really cute one. And they were like, wow, that's so adorable. And I was like, I don't think you understand what I mean, but okay, you know, onwards, you know. Yeah, that was a good one. Now they call me a little scorpion in France too, which is kind of funny. I'm like,
Go for it.
Gentleman over here.
So I want to go to that full circle and kind of theme. Your grandfather's brother, Max,
Yes.
brought my father in as a Holocaust survivor when he first arrived in Los Angeles, took him into his business, Cosmos Upholstery.
I know well.
Was his partner for many years, taught my father the trade, and my father went on to have a very successful life, and my
Oh my
parents were founders
God.
of this museum also. So I want to thank your family for facilitating another Holocaust survivor family, and the theme of we give back.
Yeah.
And my family's also testimony is on YouTube through the.
Oh,
family.
well, thank you. That's, wow. Thank you so much. Can I use this as an opportunity to tell a Max story? So Uncle Max, in his survivor testimony, this is not one of the like gruesome stories. I'll leave that for another time. You guys can all watch it on your own. But he did tell this story that I thought was hilarious, where because he was sort of 15, 16 when he was in hiding, he was always getting into trouble because he was kind of like too old to be a hidden child, but too young and immature and, you know, wild to be like a hidden adult. So he was just sort of a little feral running around the countryside in Belgium. And he told this story where, you know, resources were very much rationed at the time, and we Belgians care deeply about butter. And he used to seduce the butcher's daughter to get extra butter. And then after the war, he continued to seduce her so that he could get the extra butter and then sell it on the black market in Brussels. And it made so much sense. That story made so much sense. And I just, again, like we just will get it done no matter what. I think he used to trade cigarettes and some other stuff for butter. So again, butter is important. Don't underestimate a Belgian's relationship to butter. Yes.
Great, amazing.
Thank you.
Did your grandfather meet Cocteau at any point?
No.
Okay.
So Severin was 19 when he purchased his first piece. Cocteau was already passed away by then.
Oh, wow.
What's interesting about this first piece is that it actually, again, to tie it around, came from Les Enfants Terribles. And the piece itself is a sketch of a recurring character in the Jean Cocteau, cinematic universe, called, his name is Dargelos. And Dargelos is apparently, allegedly, sort of this like chaos agent that appears in a lot of Cocteau's work, where he's beautiful and sexy and dangerous, but also will do things to move the plot along and will, harm and help these main characters. And, in some weird way, I feel like a lot of that was so prescient, but you would have never gotten that just from the sketch that he bought. It was just a very lovely, sketch of a young man in profile. So.
One last question.
Yeah.
It's addressed to both of you. One of the things I've been, is the trauma that's been inherited, to the 3Gs.
Uh-huh.
What are a couple of ways you guys, cope with that? You being involved, I'm seeing how that.
I'm always ready to go. I think every third generation, every 3G knows what's going in the suitcase and how they're getting out. Genuinely. 2Gs too, yeah. Yep.
We were the most prepared for COVID, I think.
Oh, yeah. But, yeah, oh, yeah.
We're ready.
We're like, we got the masks.
Yeah.
We're ready. But, inherited trauma, but yeah, I think as far as 3Gs, the running joke is for sure, lots of Jewish people are just ready to drop it all and leave.
Yeah.
But I think for myself, having a grandfather who was kidnapped, I feel like, again, it's hard to say, is it trauma or is it just resilience? Is it being streetwise? I feel like being streetwise is something that really has come from having a grandfather who was himself streetwise. He had a whole life before the whole Gucci thing that, he was parking cars at Garden of Allah and the whole thing. But that's another live talk for another day. But I find myself really taking great care to get to know everybody in my life. Because, again, having someone burst through a door and say, I am your father, let's go. You kind of want to make sure that that's who they say they are. And so I think for me, part of my paranoia, my trauma, my resilience, my whatever you want to call it, is I like to really make sure I know the people around me inside and out.
Yeah. I think that's interesting because it's similar to what I would have said. I think there's lots of things, right? Like you're always prepared to have food. You never want to run out. And that is similar because I think your grandparents were rationing food and were just struggling to survive and just being able to be prepared. Some people respond by hoarding. Some people respond by always being ready to leave. There's 1,000 different ways to respond.
There's like a universal Jewish symbol, like, you know, you're in a Jewish household when like the tea bags are being reused. Like if you see a tea bag on the if you see a tea bag that's been used maybe once, maybe twice, and it's just chilling on a little dish on the counter, that is a Jewish home, my friend.
But then it's also building community, and I think like a common thread in education, and I've done so many different interviews of survivors over time, pretty much all with the museum. As I said, I've been involved for many years. And the two most common things that are really a theme of everyone's survival story, and something that I think we either consciously or subconsciously probably both carry with us, is education. And nobody can ever take what's in your mind. And I think that is like a very prevalent thing in like all of Jewish culture. Because whether they're Holocaust survivors or not, like over time, we've always been forced to move. And when you can't take anything, like you can always take your knowledge. And the second is community. And like you don't survive on your own. You survive because you learn how to trust people and depend on others. And I think
we take care of each other.
You take care of each other, and it's not just your immediate family. Yeah. So I think that's kind of how that would be my personal thing. Yeah,
we've known each other since we were 2 years old, you know?
Yeah.
The ties run deep.
Well, thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you,
coming.
everyone.